The golden lights of New York City glittered against the night sky, their glow spilling over the grand facade of the Smith Grand Hotel. Inside, David Smith sat behind his polished oak desk, staring at a photo of his late father, Brian Smith. "I hope I'm doing enough, Dad," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. At just 25, David had inherited the hotel empire his father painstakingly built from the ground up. Brian had been a legend in the hospitality industry, respected for his innovation and integrity. After his untimely passing, the responsibility of maintaining the hotel's stellar reputation fell on David's shoulders, and he wasn't just holding it steady, he was thriving. Under his leadership, the Smith Grand Hotel had secured its place among America's most luxurious destinations. Yet, in the quiet moments, David couldn't shake the nagging feeling of emptiness. His staff respected him, the board admired him, and the business world envied him. But David longed for someone who could see past his polished exterior, someone who understood the burden he carried. Enter Lila. Lila had joined the Smith Grand Hotel 2 years ago as an intern, fresh out of business school. With a sharp mind and an unrelenting work ethic, she quickly rose through the ranks. Now, as a newly appointed deputy general manager, she was a star employee, earning accolades from the board and David alike. David admired her, more than he was willing to admit. She was different from anyone he had met, focused, kind, and fiercely independent. Their interactions were always professional, but David found himself looking forward to their meetings more than he should. One afternoon, Lila walked into David's office, her tablet in hand. "Here are the projections for next quarter," she said, placing the device on his desk. "Thanks, Lila," David replied, glancing at the numbers before looking up at her. "Your work is, as always, impressive." She smiled, her dimples softening her sharp features. "Just doing my job." As she turned to leave, David hesitated. "Lila, have you ever thought about where you want to be in 5 years? She paused, her brow furrowing slightly. "I guess I want to be in a place where I'm truly happy, professionally and personally." Her words lingered long after she left, stirring something in David. He didn't know it yet, but this moment would set the stage for a series of events that would change both their lives forever. David couldn't shake the conversation with Lila. Her words had hit a nerve, and for the first time in a long while, he found himself wondering about his own happiness. Running the Smith Grand Hotel gave him purpose, but it was far from fulfilling. That night, he sat in his spacious penthouse overlooking Manhattan, nursing a glass of wine as thoughts of Lila consumed him. She was extraordinary. Her intelligence, grace, and determination made her stand out in a room full of achievers. Over the months, David had grown to admire not just her work ethic, but also the subtle kindness she displayed toward her colleagues. Yet, he felt conflicted. As her boss, he wondered if acknowledging his feelings would be a mistake. Unbeknownst to David, Lila's life had complications of its own. While she appreciated David's mentorship and respect, her heart leaned elsewhere. Jacob, a software engineer working in the hotel's IT department, had captured her attention with his easygoing charm and adventurous spirit. Unlike David's composed demeanor, Jacob was spontaneous, full of stories about hiking trips and late-night jazz sessions. Jacob, for his part, adored Lila's ambition and balance. He often teased her about being a workaholic, but his playful tone masked genuine admiration. Though Lila hadn't openly admitted her feelings to anyone, her colleagues had begun noticing the chemistry between them. One such evening, the office was abuzz with preparations for an upcoming conference. Lila worked late, perfecting a presentation. David stopped by her desk, holding 2 cups of coffee. "I thought you could use this," he said, placing one in front of her. Lila looked up, surprised but grateful. "Thanks, David. You didn't have to." He leaned against the desk, watching her scroll through slides. "You're working harder than anyone else. I just wanted to make sure you're not overdoing it." Lila smiled. I'll take a break soon, I promise." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the air seemed to change. David wanted to say more, something about how much he appreciated her, how her presence brightened even his most stressful days. But the words caught in his throat. Before the silence could grow awkward, Jacob appeared in the doorway. "Hey, Lila, ready to call it a night?" Lila's face lit up at the sight of him, and David felt an unexpected pang of jealousy. She gathered her things, thanking David for the coffee before leaving with Jacob. As he watched them walk away, David realized something with painful clarity. His feelings for Lila were no longer just admiration. They had grown into something much deeper. No one could have predicted how this tangled web of emotions would unfold. David had always prided himself on being logical, measured, and composed. But as days turned into weeks, he found himself struggling to focus on anything other than Lila. Her laughter, her dedication, even the way she furrowed her brows when concentrating, it all lingered in his mind, refusing to let him be. The tension within him reached a breaking point one evening. After a particularly grueling day, David stayed back at the office, staring out of the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of his office. The city buzzed below, oblivious to the storm in his heart. He couldn't take it anymore. He needed to tell Lila how he felt, no matter the risk. The next morning, David asked Lila to join him for dinner. "It's about an upcoming project," he had explained casually. Lila agreed without hesitation, assuming it was purely professional. The restaurant was an elegant, candlelit venue that David frequented, but tonight it felt different. His usual confidence wavered as he watched Lila walk in, radiant yet unassuming in a simple blue dress. "This place is stunning," she said, looking around before taking her seat. David smiled nervously. "I thought it would be a good spot for an important conversation." For the first half of the dinner, they discussed work, just as Lila had expected. But as the meal progressed, David's demeanor shifted. He grew quieter, his gaze lingering on her a little too long. Finally, he set down his glass of wine and leaned forward. "Lila, there's something I've been meaning to tell you," he began, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. She tilted her head, curious. "What is it?" He hesitated for a moment, then decided to plunge ahead. "I've admired you for a long time, not just for your work, but for who you are. Your kindness, your passion, your resilience. I can't ignore how I feel about you anymore." Lila froze, her eyes widening in shock. David continued, his words tumbling out like a flood. "I understand if this is unexpected, but I couldn't let another day pass without telling you. Lila, I care about you deeply." The silence that followed was agonizing. Lila looked down, her fingers nervously fidgeting with her napkin. "David, I don't know what to say," she finally murmured. "You're an incredible person and I respect you so much, but my heart belongs to someone else." David felt the air leave his lungs, as if he'd been punched. He forced a smile, masking his heartbreak. "I understand," he said quietly, though his voice cracked. The rest of the evening passed in awkward politeness, the weight of rejection hanging heavily between them. That night, David made a decision. By the end of the week, he would leave New York. Lila had never intended to hurt David. She admired him as a boss and a mentor, but her heart had always been drawn to Jacob. After David's unexpected confession, she couldn't shake the guilt that lingered. She tried to focus on her work, but her conversations with Jacob felt different now, tainted by the knowledge that someone else had been silently watching her with affection. A week later, David quietly left New York, leaving a short email to his team announcing his move to Dallas to focus on a new hotel venture. The office felt his absence like a missing piece in the intricate puzzle of their daily routines, but no one felt it as strongly as Lila. Still, life moved on. Jacob, noticing Lila's subdued mood, tried his best to cheer her up. One evening, he surprised her with a picnic in Central Park. Under the glowing city skyline, he pulled out a small velvet box. "Lila," he began, his voice soft but full of excitement. "You're the most amazing person I've ever met. I can't imagine my life without you. Will you marry me?" Lila's heart raced as she stared at the ring. She wasn't ready for this. Her emotions still felt like a storm, and part of her wondered if she was moving too fast. But Jacob's earnest smile, his unwavering belief in their love, was hard to resist. With a hesitant yet hopeful nod, she said yes. Their wedding was a modest affair, attended by close friends and family. At first, married life seemed promising. Lila found comfort in Jacob's carefree nature and his ability to make her laugh even in the toughest times. But soon, cracks began to show. Jacob's impulsive habits, once charming, became a source of conflict. Late nights out with friends, missed deadlines, and careless spending put a strain on their finances. Lila discovered his hidden gambling habit when she stumbled upon a mountain of unpaid bills one evening. "Jacob," she confronted him, her voice trembling. "What is all this?" "You've been gambling." "It's just a phase," he brushed her off, refusing to meet her gaze. "I've got it under control." But he didn't. Over the next few months, the situation worsened. Lila tried to hold on, believing she could help him change, but Jacob spiraled further into his addictions. Arguments became frequent, and their love felt like a distant memory. One rainy evening, Lila packed her bags and walked out. The dream of a perfect life with Jacob had crumbled, leaving her heartbroken and alone. For the first time, Lila began to wonder if she had made a terrible mistake. A year had passed since David left New York, and much had changed in his absence. The Smith Grand Hotel continued to thrive under the leadership of his trusted team, but whispers of his name still floated through its grand halls. To many, he was a legend who had left too soon. To a few, he was a mystery, especially to Lila. David had thrown himself into work in Dallas, overseeing the development of a new luxury resort. The project kept him busy, but it didn't fill the void Lila had unknowingly left behind. Her rejection had stung, but what hurt more was the thought of her happiness with someone else. Meanwhile, Lila was struggling to rebuild her life after leaving Jacob. She had resigned from the Smith Grand Hotel shortly after her divorce and found a position at a smaller boutique hotel. While the job kept her afloat, it lacked the grandeur and challenges of her previous role. She missed the ambition and drive that once defined her career. The annual meeting of the Smith Grand Hotel brought David back to New York. His return was unannounced. He wanted to avoid the fuss. Stepping into the hotel's grand lobby, he felt a pang of nostalgia. Everything was as he remembered: lavish chandeliers, marble floors, and the faint scent of fresh lilies. "Mr. Smith," Claire, his loyal secretary, greeted him with a wide smile. "It's so good to have you back." "It's good to be back, Claire," David replied, his voice calm but tinged with emotion. "How's everyone doing?" Claire hesitated before answering. "Most of the team is doing great, but there's something you should know about Lila." David stiffened at the mention of her name, his heart betraying the composure he tried to maintain. "What about her?" "She left the hotel shortly after you did," Claire said carefully. "She got married, but things didn't work out. I heard she's been through a lot. Jacob wasn't who she thought he was." The news hit David like a tidal wave. Lila was divorced? He couldn't help but wonder how much pain she had endured, and whether she had someone to lean on. Later that evening, David sat in his hotel suite, staring at a piece of paper with Lila's address written on it. Claire had provided it, sensing he would want to know. David leaned back, conflicted. Should he reach out, or would it be selfish to step back into her life? But as the night wore on, one thought became clear. He needed to see her, not for himself, but to offer her the chance at something better. The next day, David stood outside Lila's modest apartment building, his heart pounding. He had no idea what to expect, but as he raised his hand to knock, he knew there was no turning back. Lila opened the door to find David standing there, his tall frame silhouetted against the late afternoon light. For a moment, she didn't speak. Her breath caught in her throat. He looked the same, calm, composed, and unmistakably David. Yet there was something different in his eyes, something softer. "David?" she finally managed to say, her voice tinged with surprise. "Hi, Lila," he said, offering a faint smile. I heard about everything. Can we talk?" Lila hesitated, her instinct to shield herself from judgment warring with the warmth of an old friend. Finally, she stepped aside and motioned for him to enter. Her apartment was modest but cozy, a far cry from the luxury she had once been surrounded by. David noted the worn furniture, the simple decor, and the faint smell of freshly brewed coffee. It was a stark reminder of how far her life had changed. They sat across from each other at a small dining table. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence was heavy with unspoken emotions. Finally, David broke the tension. "I didn't come here to reopen old wounds," he began gently. I wanted to make sure you're okay." Lila's lips curved into a bittersweet smile. "That's kind of you, David. But I'm fine, really. I've learned to stand on my own." He nodded, sensing the strength in her words, but also the vulnerability she tried to hide. "I'm proud of you," he said sincerely. "I can't imagine how hard it's been." Her gaze dropped to the table, and for the first time, her walls began to crack. "It wasn't easy," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought Jacob was my future, but he wasn't the person I believed him to be." David leaned forward, his tone gentle yet firm. "You deserve so much more, Lila. You deserve happiness, respect, and a career that makes you feel alive again." She looked up, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "That life feels so far away now." "It doesn't have to be," David said. "Come back to the Smith Grand Hotel. We need someone like you, someone who understands what it takes to succeed. I need someone like you." Lila froze, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "Are you serious?" "Completely," he said. "I've already spoken to the board. The deputy general manager position is yours if you want it." For the first time in months, hope flickered in Lila's chest. She had spent so long in survival mode, she had forgotten what it felt like to dream. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her voice cautious but tinged with possibility. As David left her apartment, he felt a small sense of relief. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew this: Lila deserved a second chance, and he would be there to see it through. Lila's return to the Smith Grand Hotel was met with mixed reactions. For many of the staff, it was a welcome sight. Her reputation for fairness and competence had left an indelible mark, and whispers of her comeback quickly spread through the halls. However, not everyone was thrilled, particularly the board of directors. "This is highly irregular," began Mr. Whitman, the senior-most board member, as the meeting convened to discuss David's decision. "Reinstating someone who left on such uncertain terms? It's risky." David sat at the head of the table, his calm demeanor masking his irritation. Lila's departure had nothing to do with her performance. She was, and still is, one of the most talented professionals we've had. Whitman wasn't convinced. Her personal history could be a liability. The media— "I'll handle the media," David cut him off, his voice firm. "And if there's any fallout, I'll take full responsibility. But I won't let us lose someone as valuable as Lila because of assumptions or fears." The boardroom buzzed with murmurs, but David's unwavering conviction silenced further objections. After a tense vote, Lila's reinstatement was approved. Later that day, Lila stood outside David's office, nervously clutching the new badge that marked her return as deputy general manager. Her hands trembled slightly as she knocked. "Come in," David called. She stepped inside, the familiar scent of polished wood and the soft hum of the city beyond the windows instantly transporting her back. David looked up from his desk, a small smile playing on his lips. "How does it feel to be back?" he asked. "Surreal," Lila admitted. "I wasn't sure this would ever happen." "Well, it has," David said, rising to stand in front of her. "And I have no doubt you'll exceed everyone's expectations. You always have." Lila felt a warmth in his words, a quiet reassurance she hadn't realized she needed. "Thank you, David, for everything." "Don't thank me yet," he teased lightly. "The board wasn't exactly thrilled about my decision. You might have to prove them wrong." "I intend to," she said confidently. In the weeks that followed, Lila poured herself into her work. She revitalized operations, introduced new efficiency measures, and began rebuilding the trust and respect she had once commanded. But as the days turned into nights, she found herself noticing things about David she hadn't before. The way he carried the weight of the hotel, the quiet kindness behind his stern exterior, and the unshakable belief he had in her. Lila had always seen David as a mentor, but now, something had shifted. She couldn't deny the growing warmth she felt when he was near. The question lingering in her mind was simple, yet terrifying. Could she allow herself to feel this way after everything that had happened? The long corridors of the Smith Grand Hotel were alive with energy as Lila settled into her role once more. She navigated meetings, oversaw major events, and worked late into the evenings with a renewed sense of purpose. Her reputation as a diligent and innovative leader was quickly re-established, but beneath the surface, something more personal was shifting. David. His presence loomed in every corner of her life now. Their interactions had always been professional, but lately there was an undercurrent of something deeper. She caught herself smiling at his jokes during team meetings, lingering a little too long after he left the room, and wondering if his kind words were more than just encouragement. David, however, kept his distance. Despite his feelings, he was determined not to repeat past mistakes. He had already risked too much by bringing Lila back into the fold, and he didn't want to pressure her. Instead, he let his actions speak for themselves, offering support, shielding her from boardroom politics, and quietly celebrating her successes from afar. One evening, Lila found herself alone in the hotel's rooftop lounge, gazing out at the sprawling Manhattan skyline. A warm breeze rustled her hair as she sipped a glass of wine, lost in thought. "Penny for your thoughts?" She turned to see David standing behind her, his hands in his pockets and a faint smile on his face. "Just thinking about how far I've come," she admitted. "A year ago, I didn't think I'd ever feel this way again, like I belong somewhere." "You've always belonged here," David said softly, moving to stand beside her. "Even when you weren't here, this place was still a reflection of your hard work." Lila looked at him, her heart swelling with gratitude and something she couldn't quite name. "Thank you, David, for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself." He turned to her, his expression earnest. "You've earned every bit of it, Lila, and for what it's worth, I'm proud of you." Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, the air between them seemed to crackle. Lila felt her defenses slipping, her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't need to," David replied, stepping back slightly, his voice gentle but firm. "This isn't about me. It's about you finding what makes you happy." As he walked away, Lila felt an ache in her chest. For so long, she had been focused on survival, rebuilding, and proving herself. But now, she couldn't ignore the growing realization that her happiness might be tied to the very person who had given her this second chance. Could she let herself feel this way? Or was she too afraid to risk it all again? The annual gala of the Smith Grand Hotel was always a spectacle, drawing the city's elite into its gilded ballroom. This year's event was no different, with champagne flowing freely and a live orchestra filling the air with enchanting melodies. For Lila, it was her first major event since her return, and she was determined to make it flawless. David watched from a distance as Lila moved through the crowd, her poise and charm captivating everyone she spoke to. Dressed in a sleek black gown, she looked every bit the confident leader she once was. He couldn't help but feel proud, and perhaps a bit wistful. As the evening wore on, David excused himself from a conversation with a board member and made his way toward the ballroom's side hallways for a moment of quiet. Lila, noticing his absence, followed him instinctively, finding him leaning against the wall near the grand staircase. "Escaping your own event?" she teased lightly. He turned, a small smile playing on his lips. "Just needed some air. It's your event as much as mine now, you know." Lila laughed softly, stepping closer. "Well, it's running smoothly. You can relax." Before David could respond, a loud crash shattered the moment. The sound of glass breaking echoed from the kitchen area, followed by panicked shouts. Both of them turned toward the commotion, their instincts kicking in. A staff member burst into the hallway, his face pale. "There's a fire in the south wing." David's heart dropped. "Evacuate everyone immediately," he commanded, his voice calm but urgent. "Lila, go with them and make sure the guests are safe." Lila hesitated, her eyes darting toward the ballroom. "What about you?" "I'll make sure everyone in the staff quarters gets out," he said firmly. As the alarms blared and chaos unfolded, David worked quickly, helping the remaining employees evacuate. Lila, meanwhile, ensured the guests exited safely through the main doors. But as she conducted a final sweep of the ballroom, she noticed thick smoke seeping through the side door. Her heart raced. One of the staff had mentioned storing supplies in the adjacent hall earlier. She couldn't leave without checking. Lila pushed the door open, coughing as smoke engulfed her. The heat was intense, and flames danced along the walls. "Is anyone here?" she shouted, her voice cracking. In the lobby, David emerged from the stairwell and scanned the crowd for Lila. When he didn't see her, a cold fear gripped him. "Where's Lila?" he demanded. "She went back into the ballroom," someone stammered. Without hesitation, David rushed toward the blaze. Ignoring the warnings of the fire crew, he pushed through the smoke, calling out her name. When he found her, she was crouched near the far corner, trying to shield herself from the flames. Relief and terror washed over him. "Lila!" She turned, her face streaked with soot, and gasped as she saw him. "David, you shouldn't be here!" "We're getting out. Now," he said, grabbing her arm. Together, they navigated through the smoke, dodging falling debris as the fire roared around them. Finally, they stumbled into the fresh night air, coughing but alive. The crowd erupted into applause as the fire crew moved in. David collapsed onto the pavement, pulling Lila close as relief overwhelmed him. "Why would you do that?" she asked, her voice trembling. He looked at her, his expression raw. "Because I couldn't lose you." Lila stared at him, her walls crumbling entirely. For the first time, she allowed herself to see the depth of his feelings, and her own. The hospital room was quiet except for the faint beeping of the heart monitor. Lila stirred, her body aching, but her mind racing. Memories of the fire and David's desperate rescue flashed through her mind, leaving her breathless. She turned her head to find him sitting in a chair near the window, his shirt soot-streaked, and his face etched with exhaustion. "You're awake," David said softly, rising to his feet. Lila managed a weak smile. "Barely. How long have you been here?" "All night," he admitted, his voice hoarse. "I wasn't going to leave until I knew you were okay." Her heart ached at the sight of him. This man, who had risked everything to save her, was more than a boss, more than a friend. He was her anchor, the person who had believed in her when no one else had. "David," she began, her voice trembling, "why did you come back for me? You could have— Don't, he interrupted gently, moving closer to her bed. Don't tell me I shouldn't have done it. I couldn't let anything happen to you, Lila. Not now. Not ever. Tears welled in her eyes as the full weight of his words sank in. She had spent so long building walls around her heart, afraid to let anyone in after the pain of her failed marriage. But David had torn those walls down with his unwavering love and quiet strength. I don't deserve you, she whispered, her voice cracking. He reached for her hand, his touch warm and steady. You deserve everything, Lila. Happiness, love, a second chance. All of it. And if you'll let me, I want to be the one to give it to you. For a moment, silence filled the room as Lila searched his face, seeing nothing but sincerity and care. I was so blind, she said finally, a tear slipping down her cheek. I didn't see what was right in front of me. I'm sorry, David. You don't have to apologize, he said, brushing her tear away gently. I've waited this long. I would have waited forever. Lila's lips quivered into a smile. You won't have to. 2 weeks later, the grand ballroom of the Smith Grand Hotel was filled once more, but this time, it wasn't for a business event. Guests gathered for the wedding of David and Lila, their love story coming full circle in the place that had brought them together. As Lila walked down the aisle, her gaze locked on David's, she felt a peace she hadn't known in years. The trials they had faced, the pain and heartbreak, they had all led to this moment. When David took her hands at the altar, his voice was steady but filled with emotion. You were always my heart, Lila, from the moment I met you. And you were mine, she whispered, tears of joy in her eyes. Their vows echoed through the room, sealing a love forged through fire, patience, and resilience. The applause that followed was thunderous, but for David and Lila, the world had faded away. As they danced under the glittering chandeliers, David leaned in close and whispered, This is just the beginning. And for them, it truly was.